Okay, let's get into this. Imagine just an ordinary moment in Brooklyn right before the 2016 election.
Right.
The source we're looking at today, especially Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, suggests that moment, that whole period, wasn't just typical politics.
No, it paints it as more of a window onto these much deeper, longer-term forces within American society, things that have been simmering for a long time.
Exactly. So our mission, yours and mine and everyone listening, is to try and understand those underlying dynamics, the ones that maybe made that election outcome and, well, everything that came after, seem less surprising if you look through this particular lens.
It shifts the perspective, doesn't it, away from just the campaign trail noise.
Totally. I mean, the source points out the basic setup. First-time female major party candidate, lots of experience.
Versus a reality TV star with, zero political background.
And the predictions mostly went one way, but the result, well, it was different.
And the core idea here, the source argues, is that this was bigger than just politics. It was framed as an existential fight for primacy.
Tied to shifting demographics.
Yeah, exactly. And this unspoken hierarchy based on race, that the source says, dates back before the U.S. was even a country.
There's mention of a low rumble, right? A kind of growing anxiety.
Yes, among the historically dominant group, those of European ancestry, as the Census Bureau projected that, whites would no longer be the majority by around 2042.
And that anxiety, the source connects it to the support for a figure seen as what was the phrase, a cocksure champion for the dominant caste.
Right. And the example given, that New Jersey police commander, it's pretty chilling.
His statements about African Americans calling the candidate the last hope for white people, it's stark.
And the violence, too.
Yeah.
Assaulting that black teenager in the pool, it speaks volumes about that perceived entitlement and, well, enforcing the lines.
So the source is saying the election aftermath wasn't about healing divisions.
Quite the opposite, it suggests. These underlying tensions really broke through to the surface.
Like the examples given. The man in Georgia feeling freer to express Confederate ideas.
Or the attack in Portland, the racial and anti-Muslim aspect.
In Charlottesville, Heather Heyer.
Yeah. The source presents these not as isolated incidents, you see, but as visible signs of these deeper unresolved issues bubbling up. It's suggesting a pattern where violence wasn't random, but a tool to maintain the system.
The source also mentions other disruptions. The impeachment, the lack of press briefings, the pandemic response.
All contributing to this sense, maybe, that the U.S. wasn't a fully functional democracy at that point.
Which brings us back to that central question the source poses. What really explains the choice of this untested celebrity whose words resonated with extremists?
And it pushes back on simple answers, right? Like it wasn't just the economy or just wanting change. It hints at something deeper.
Something rooted in the very foundations. To understand it, the source says we need to look beneath the history of one's country.
It's like digging into family history, maybe finding things that are uncomfortable, but necessary to understand the present.
And that's where the house analogy comes in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's powerful. An old house, inherited, with flaws in the foundation.
Even if your ancestors didn't build it, you live there now. You inherit the leaky roof, the cracked walls, the problem.
Exactly. You're the current occupant dealing with the consequences of how it was built.
And the framework the source uses to explain these foundational flaws is caste.
Right. Not race exactly, though race is a primary tool, but caste. An internalized ranking, as it says. Unspoken, often unacknowledged.
Based largely on appearance.
And people just sort of adhere to it subconsciously. Its invisibility is its strength, the source argues, an ever-present through line.
It becomes really obvious, maybe, only during times of stress or upheaval.
That's the idea. And it's important to grasp that while race is central to how it operates in America, caste itself is this broader concept of a rigid, inherited social hierarchy.
The source focuses mainly on the poles. European Americans at the top, African Americans at the bottom. The main beneficiaries and targets.
And it traces the origins way back. Colonial Virginia, 1619, those first distinctions about who could be enslaved for life versus who couldn't.
Those early laws giving more privileges to European indentured servants.
Right, and kind of creating white as the opposite of black, that solidified the hierarchy.
The historian Kenneth Stamp is mentioned, calling it a caste system based on white supremacy and caste solidarity.
Yeah, strong words, but that's the argument being presented.
And the source is careful to say this isn't about blaming people today.
No, it's about understanding, recognizing this hidden work of a caste system to better understand America. And maybe seeing parallels elsewhere helps too.
The author mentions connecting with earlier scholars who studied caste in India and the US.
Right, showing this isn't a totally new lens, but builds on a tradition of looking at these hidden structures.
There's even that matrix analogy.
Yeah, like caste is the underlying master program, unseen but deeply embedded, and it resists threats.
Or the stage analogy. Society as a long-running play.
Where people are cast into roles based on their assigned place, not necessarily who they are inside. And this play premiered, so to speak, back in colonial Virginia.
And initially, religion played a bigger part than race, right?
Well, Christianity was linked to Europeans, and that initially offered some protection from lifetime enslavement. But that shifted.
Shifted towards race as the justification for subjugating indigenous people and Africans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then came the enforcement. The source gives examples like Hugh Davis punished in 1630 for relations with a black woman.
And that 1691 Virginia law outlawing marriage between blacks and whites, that was early.
Very early. And it became the model for laws across most states for centuries. The penalties for crossing that boundary, especially for lower caste men and upper caste women, were incredibly severe, sometimes death.
It's shocking to see that 1958 Gallup poll mentioned 94% of white Americans disapproving of interracial marriage then. It shows how long that pillar held.
Deeply ingrained, and the consequences could be brutal, like the Willie James story from 1944.
Just horrific. A young boy lynched for giving a Valentine's card to a white girl.
And no justice. Despite evidence, despite NAACP involvement, it's a chilling example of enforcing those caste lines with ultimate violence.
Then there's the pillar about purity versus pollution.
Yeah, the idea that the dominant caste maintains its perceived purity by avoiding contact. The public pool example in Newton, Kansas.
Where black people were banned because whites wouldn't swim in water that had touched black skin.
It's hard to fathom, but it happened. And the story of Al, the young black swimmer forced out, shows the psychological scars that leaves.
The source also points out that defining whiteness itself was complicated.
Definitely. That 1923 Supreme Court case, Bhagat Singh Thind, he argued he was scientifically Caucasian from India.
But the court said no because the average man wouldn't see him as white. It shows whiteness was a social construct, not fixed biology.
Absolutely. It could shift based on who needed to be included or excluded from the dominant caste.
Okay, next pillar. Occupational hierarchy.
Right. Historically limiting the kinds of work the subordinate caste could do. Often menial roles, sometimes even roles designed for ridicule, like in entertainment.
Even in sports, right? Specific expectations.
Yeah, the idea was you had to know and remain in their place, even if you were talented. Advancement was okay, maybe, but not challenging the fundamental order.
Which ties into dehumanization and stigma.
Examples like forcing black adults to be called by their first names, even by white children.
But the story of Miss Hale insisting on Miss is powerful resistance.
It is. Her father being proud of her for demanding that basic dignity, and the author's own experience in the boutique.
Being dismissed instantly, the assumption she couldn't be the one with the appointment.
It shows how these biases persist, often unconsciously, in everyday interactions.
And it's crucial to remember what the science says, as the source points out.
Yes, the Human Genome Project, we're 99.9% the same. Race is social, not biological.
Ashley Montagu called it a deliberate creation of an exploiting class. Strong words again.
They are. Then comes terror as enforcement, cruelty as control.
This is where the history gets incredibly dark. Whippings, torture, lynching, presented as routine tools.
The lynching of Will Brown in Omaha is a terrifying example. The mayor trying to ensure due process, but the mob.
Overruling law with caste-based violence. Even that reference to the movie The Oxbow incident.
Yeah, Henry Fonda warning about mob justice. It taps into that same theme of bypassing law to enforce perceived hierarchy.
And finally, the eighth pillar, inherent superiority versus inherent inferiority.
Perpetuating the belief that the dominant caste is naturally better. Media portrayals play a huge role here.
The contrast between Mary Pickford and Louise Beavers in films, reinforcing those roles visually.
Exactly. And it wasn't just cultural. That North Carolina judge's ruling about needing to maintain subordination, it had legal backing.
Even small interactions, like the farmer beaten for asking for a receipt.
It all serves to enforce who's supposedly superior and who's inferior.
The Jane Elliott experiment, brown eyes versus blue eyes, is such a clear demonstration of this dynamic.
It really is. How quickly people fall into dominant and subordinate roles based on completely arbitrary distinctions, and how it affects their behavior, their confidence, even their performance.
Which leads to that idea of central miscasting, the conversation in India.
Right, where caste is openly discussed, unlike in the U.S., despite, the source argues, so many parallels. It raises the question of why the denial is so strong in America.
Then the source connects this framework to more recent anxieties. Dominant group status threat.
Yeah, linking the rising depths of despair among middle-aged white Americans to a perceived loss of status as society changes.
Demographics shifting, social norms evolving.
And how slogans like "Take Our Country Back" or "Make America Great Again" might tap into that anxiety of losing that top spot in the hierarchy.
Lillian Smith's point about the white working class needing someone to feel better than?
Exactly. It highlights the psychological aspect. In a system built on hierarchy, equality can feel like a step down for those who've always been on top.
And the source shows these pentacles of caste reaching into modern life in concrete ways.
The hiring disparities, white felons getting jobs over black non-felons.
Medical treatment differences. Fewer procedures for black patients for some things, but higher amputation rates for others.
And the undertreatment of pain based on false beliefs about pain tolerance. These aren't just anecdotes. They show systemic bias rooted in these old ideas.
The section on scapegoating is powerful too. The Charles Stewart case.
A classic, tragic example. White man kills his wife, blames a fictional black attacker.
And the whole city erupts in a racially charged manhunt targeting black men.
Until the truth comes out. It shows how readily society can project guilt onto the subordinate caste. The Anthony Stephen house bombing case is another example where initial assumptions were skewed by race and location.
The insecure alphas analogy, comparing it to dog behavior, that's interesting.
Yeah, suggesting that true authority doesn't need constant aggression. Bullying comes from insecurity about one's position in the hierarchy.
It makes you think about certain leadership styles, doesn't it?
It does. Then there's the heartbreaking burden of protection.
Black parents having to teach their kids how to navigate potential dangers just because of their race, limiting their freedom, their innocence.
It's a constant vigilance that dominant caste parents rarely have to consider. A profound difference in daily life created by the system.
And the everyday slights just keep accumulating. The professor questioned about his own mail.
The engineer ignored by the contractor.
The babysitter questioned for being with white kids.
The author's airport experience. It's this constant low-level suspicion and disrespect.
Undermining people's sense of belonging and legitimacy, reinforcing that lower status.
Which ties into the urgent necessity of a bottom rung. The idea that the dominant group needs a subordinate group to define itself against.
Like Lillian Smith said, always needing someone to feel superior to.
And historically, when black people advanced, like after Reconstruction, there was backlash. Lynchings, KKK, Jim Crow. All to push them back down.
Even hiring less competent black teachers in segregated schools, deliberately undermining their own community.
It's about actively maintaining the hierarchy. And media portrayals of poverty often reinforce those negative stereotypes about the bottom rung.
The immigrant experience also fits into this framework.
Yeah, European immigrants could often assimilate and gain white status over time. But black immigrants often face the existing racial caste, sometimes losing status if they shed cultural markers that distinguish them from black Americans.
The system forces them into the pre-existing bottom category.
Largely, yes. The source also mentions internalized oppression,
where people from marginalized groups, maybe to survive or advance, end up upholding the system themselves.
It's a complex dynamic, rejecting or diminishing their own group to gain acceptance from the dominant one.
That account of the researchers in the Jim Crow South is incredible.
Allison Davis, Elizabeth Davis, St. Clair Drake, having secret meetings, navigating incredibly strict rules just to study the system.
It shows how pervasive and controlling it was. You couldn't even study it openly without risk.
Absolutely. And the Satchel Paige story?
A baseball legend denied the chance to play in the majors for so long simply because he was black.
It perfectly illustrates the illogic of caste, the sheer waste of talent and potential caused by these arbitrary divisions.
The source then takes a turn, looking at complicity, the willing susceptibility to evil.
Using Nazi Germany as a parallel, the cheering crowds, how ordinary people get swept up.
It poses that uncomfortable question. What would we do in that situation? How easy is it to become complicit?
It's a chilling thought. And the consequences of caste section gives more examples, that awkward silence when someone identifies as Nordish.
Showing how those old eugenicist ideas still echo.
Or the black judge comforting the white felon, an inversion of expected roles that feels noteworthy because of the caste system.
The image of the black boy hugging the white police officer, the source suggests we need to look deeper than the surface image.
Right. It might obscure deeper suffering or systemic issues. And the point about forgiveness often being demanded of the subordinate caste without addressing the root causes.
That little boy refusing to forgive the woman who falsely accused him? A raw sense of justice.
Unconditioned by the expectation to just smooth things over.
Then, shock troops on the borders of hierarchy. Free black people being seen as a threat just by existing.
Their freedom challenged the whole basis of inherent inferiority. And the example of the black women kicked off the wine train.
For laughing while black, policing behavior in perceived white spaces.
It shows how the boundaries are constantly monitored and enforced, often over minor perceived infractions.
The source even brings in physiology. Cortisol, telomeres, the lethality of caste.
Yeah, the idea that the chronic stress of navigating this system actually impacts physical health, shortens lives.
And the Nigerian immigrant's reaction to the good English comment.
It highlights the constant microaggressions, the assumptions based on appearance that contribute to that stress.
Okay, so how does this framework apply to more recent politics, the election of Barack Obama?
The source offers a caste-based perspective, suggesting maybe his background, son of a white Kansan and a Kenyan father, made him seem less threatening to the existing hierarchy than someone directly descended from American slavery.
A sort of outsider status?
Perhaps. But the backlash was immediate and intense, wasn't it? Obstructionism.
The "you lie" outburst during the healthcare speech.
Exactly. Presented as the caste system reacting forcefully to someone from the subordinate caste occupying the highest position. It was a stark display of disrespect, crossing established lines.
Yet, paradoxically, many white Americans apparently weren't that worried he'd favor black people.
Which the source suggests might show an unconscious faith in the caste system's resilience. A belief that the structure itself would hold, regardless of who was president.
So the source sees the 2016 election, the election of Donald Trump, as a turning point and the resurgence of caste.
Arguing it was driven significantly by those dominant group anxieties about losing status, about the hierarchy eroding.
And it analyzes how the parties responded to their bases through this lens. Republicans catering to white evangelical anxieties.
While Democrats, the source argues, maybe didn't fully address the core concerns of their black base, who were most affected by the caste system's legacy.
Then there's a history of backlash. How even after slavery ended, the system found ways to persist.
Right, the loophole in the 13th Amendment allowing forced labor for convicts, leading to convict leasing.
The abandonment of Reconstruction, the rise of Confederate monuments.
All signs, the source argues, that the underlying caste structure wasn't dismantled by the Civil War, it just adapted.
And the difficulty removing those statues, like in New Orleans with threats of violence.
It shows how fiercely those symbols and the system they represent are still defended. The source contrasts this with Germany's handling of its Nazi past and asks, why aren't we ashamed?
A provocative question indeed. The rise of Black Lives Matter is seen as connected to this, right? Democracy on the ballot.
Yeah, a growing awareness of systemic injustice and the disillusionment with figures like Atticus Finch in Go Set a Watchman.
Realizing maybe our heroes weren't always heroic on these issues. It reflects a broader unmasking of comforting narratives.
The source also links America's stingy aid to the poor compared to other nations, and its lower rankings on social indicators.
Infant mortality, education, happiness.
To the legacy of slavery and caste, arguing it fosters a lack of empathy and trust, dividing society against itself.
The anecdote from India, shedding the sacred thread, offers that cross-cultural view again. The high caste man's privileged despair.
His moment of realizing the casual disrespect shown to the Dalit worker, it provides perspective.
Contrasted with the white American woman's meltdown over a minor inconvenience.
Highlighting the fragility, perhaps, of some in the dominant caste when their expectations of deference aren't met.
The radicalization of the dominant caste is mentioned briefly with that plumber example.
His detachment, his casual comment about his father, hints at how ingrained biases can become normalized.
But then there's hope, maybe, in figures like Einstein, a refuge from caste.
Yes, his offering shelter to Marian Anderson when hotels refused her. His empathy, born from his own experience of prejudice.
His refusal to just accept the American system, his discomfort with being expected to look down on Black people.
It shows individual agency is possible, even within a powerful system.
So, wrapping up, the epilogue calls caste a disease affecting everyone.
Right. And argues that tackling this underlying structure is more critical than any single election outcome.
It points out that benefits often flowed to all Americans, including white women, from the subordinate caste's fight for civil rights.
Highlighting interconnectedness. And Germany's post-Nazi efforts are presented as proof that change is possible, however difficult.
The banality of evil, how ordinary people uphold the system.
And the call for radical empathy. Actively trying to understand others' experiences.
Recognizing that privilege comes with a moral duty to act against injustice. Because ultimately, everyone benefits when the most disadvantaged are cared for.
That's the core message.
So, to recap our deep dive, we've really unpacked this concept of caste as a foundational, often hidden structure in America. We saw how the source uses it to explain the 2016 election, historical patterns, and ongoing societal issues.
Yeah, looking at those 8 pillars, the historical examples, the modern manifestations, the parallels elsewhere, it provides a different lens.
The key takeaway for you listening is that this framework offers a way to see beneath the surface, to understand the deeper roots of divisions and inequalities that we grapple with constantly.
It challenges us, really.
Yeah.
And the source leaves us with that provocative thought. Can America truly heal and progress without confronting this unnamed caste system head-on?
Suggesting that just dealing with symptoms won't fix the toxins upstream. Germany's path is offered as one possible model, however imperfect.
So we encourage you to reflect on this. Where do you see these dynamics playing out in your own world? And what does that call for radical empathy mean in practice? How do we start listening differently?
Because the source argues we're all interconnected in this system, and real change benefits everyone.